When the F4U Corsair first tore through Pacific skies, it didn't just look different, it sounded different. Its bent wings and eerie whistling roar made it both feared and misunderstood. American pilots called it the Whistling Death, while Japanese forces at first dismissed it as flawed and clumsy. But soon, reality struck. This wasn't a fighter to mock. It was a predator, rewriting aerial warfare and leaving Japan scrambling for answers. In early 1943, the F4U Corsair entered the Pacific theater, and with it came confusion, skepticism, and eventual terror. Unlike the familiar silhouettes of earlier American fighters, the Corsair was a strange beast. Its inverted gull wings bent downward, its fuselage stretched longer, and its massive propeller spun like a windmill of destruction. At first, even U.S. crews questioned it, wondering if such an ungainly design could ever dominate the sky. But the moment it met Japanese fighters, perceptions shifted instantly. Pilots who had grown used to the Mitsubishi Zero's agility suddenly faced something entirely new: raw speed and brute force. The Corsair could dive past 400 miles per hour, climb back into position, and unleash 6.50 caliber machine guns in a single devastating pass. Field reports from Rabaul and Bougainville began trickling into Tokyo, describing encounters with a blue demon. Japanese pilots who mistook it for the F-6F Hellcat soon realized they were dealing with something faster, stronger, and deadlier. The Zero's once proud dominance was shattered by a machine that didn't dance. It smashed. Veteran Japanese aces found themselves cornered, outgunned, and overwhelmed. The Corsair didn't engage in long duels. It slashed, struck, and vanished before they could react. By mid-1943, Tokyo understood the truth. The skies no longer belonged to the Zero. A new predator had arrived, and its roar carried the promise of Japan's downfall. When Japanese intelligence first laid eyes on the Corsair, their analysts couldn't stop criticizing it. Its massive nose looked ungainly, its oversized propeller seemed impractical, and its strange gull wings appeared almost deformed. Reports mocked its cramped, heavily framed cockpit, the so-called birdcage, claiming it offered poor visibility. To them, it was a clumsy brute, a rushed American design with little chance of surviving in agile dogfights. But these dismissals hit a crucial miscalculation. The bent wings weren't cosmetic, they enabled the Corsair to fit the largest propeller ever mounted on a Navy fighter. Behind that propeller sat the 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, a monster of engineering that gave the Corsair unmatched acceleration and terrifying dive speeds. In the air, ridicule turned to panic. Japanese pilots soon discovered that while their Zeros could turn tightly, the Corsair could dive beyond reach and climb back with devastating momentum. When it returned, it carried 6 heavy machine guns capable of shredding even veteran aces. By 1944, the tone of Japanese field reports had shifted. Notes from downed Zero squadrons revealed admissions of fear. The new American fighter has overwhelming forward firepower. It strikes fast and disappears before retaliation. What once seemed like design flaws were, in truth, signatures of superiority. The bent wings were not deformities, they were the shadow of death. The birdcage wasn't a prison, it was a predator's perch, overlooking a sky that Japan no longer controlled. Ironically, the Corsair's greatest strength almost became its downfall. Early in its service, the U.S. Navy struggled to land it on carriers. Its long nose blocked forward visibility, and its stiff landing gear caused it to bounce down decks or crash into the sea. Japanese observers smirked at reports of American deck crews cursing the ungainly beast. Naval intelligence concluded that the Corsair was too dangerous for carrier operations, leaving it confined to land bases. But this supposed weakness fooled Japan into a fatal assumption. They believed the Corsair was land-based only, limited in reach and incapable of operating at sea. That assumption shaped their strategies. Yet while the Navy wrestled with carrier landings, the U.S. Marine Corps embraced the Corsair. From muddy improvised island airstrips on Bougainville, Guadalcanal, and Peleliu, Corsair squadrons tore across the Pacific, delivering devastating ground support and clearing the skies. By 1944, American engineers had solved its deck issues. The Corsair was finally carrier-ready. When Japanese pilots suddenly encountered Corsairs launching from U.S. carriers, disbelief spread through their ranks. A captured report expressed shock. "We believed the blue fighter could not land on ships. Now they come from the sea. There is no escape." What once looked like a flaw had become a tactical trap. The Corsair struck from both sea and land, overwhelming defenses and breaking doctrines. The very problem that had once kept it off carriers was now one of its deadliest surprises. For Japan, there was no safe harbor left. Numbers rarely lie, and when Japanese engineers studied the Corsair's specifications, they were stunned. The F4U wasn't just another American fighter. It was a machine that rewrote the rules. With a top speed of 446 miles per hour and dive rates exceeding 500 miles per hour, the Corsair was the fastest carrier-based aircraft of the war. Japanese doctrine prized agility, but no amount of nimbleness could counter such raw speed. At the heart of the Corsair was its monstrous Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine. Combined with a massive 13-foot propeller, it gave the aircraft frightening acceleration and climb performance. In combat, this meant the Corsair could dictate the fight. It chose when to attack and when to disengage, leaving Japanese pilots reactive instead of dominant. The Zero, once feared for its agility, became outdated almost overnight. Its lack of armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, and bulletproof glass made it vulnerable to the Corsair's heavy guns. Japanese pilots discovered, often fatally, that a single burst from 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns could rip their lightweight planes apart. What shocked engineers most wasn't only the firepower, but the survivability. Corsairs could take hits and keep flying. Zeros, by contrast, erupted into flames from even minor damage. In the unforgiving logic of war, durability mattered more than elegance. Captured documents reveal the grudging respect of Japanese analysts. The American fighter is not beautiful, but it is effective. It is fast, armored, and deadly. The Corsair proved that speed, power, and protection could overwhelm agility and tradition. In one machine, America had built the template for the future of air dominance. But raw numbers only tell part of the story. Wait until you see what happened when the Corsair met Japan's most prized fighters head-on. When the Corsair finally met Japanese fighters head-on, the results were devastating. In the Solomon Islands, Corsair squadrons engaged formations of Mitsubishi Zeros and Nakajima Oscars, Japan's pride and joy. For years, these light, nimble fighters had dominated Pacific dogfights, but the Corsair flipped the script. It didn't bother with turning contests. Instead, it struck with brutal hit-and-run attacks. Corsair pilots learned to use vertical tactics, diving from above, unleashing fire, then climbing back into safety. Japanese aircraft, optimized for agility at low speeds, simply couldn't follow. Their lightweight frames stalled or broke apart under high-speed maneuvers. What once had been a battlefield of graceful duels became a slaughterhouse of slashing attacks. Veteran Japanese aces reported with growing frustration that American pilots no longer played their game. One skilled Zero pilot, Lieutenant Hiroshi Nishizawa, bitterly described the Corsair as a fighter with no honor. To him, it didn't duel, it killed. The truth was undeniable. The Corsair had shattered the very philosophy of Japanese aerial combat. By the Battle of Okinawa, Corsair squadrons weren't just holding their own, They were breaking kamikaze waves before they could even approach Allied fleets. Thousands of lives were saved by these relentless guardians. Japanese commanders reviewing battle reports admitted that their best aircraft were being systematically destroyed. The Zero and Oscar, once symbols of dominance, became symbols of futility. The Corsair didn't just outfight them, it rewrote the rules of the skies, leaving Japan's aerial strategy obsolete. The age of nimble duels was over. The age of speed, power, and overwhelming firepower had begun. By 1944, the Corsair's deadliest weapon wasn't only its speed or guns, it was fear. The fighter's unique engine design produced an eerie, high-pitched scream as air rushed through its intakes. American Marines nicknamed it the Whistling Death. Soon, Japanese pilots adopted the same phrase, but with far darker meaning. For seasoned aviators, the sound became a psychological trigger. Reports described men freezing at the noise even before the plane appeared. Training in honor and sacrifice could not erase the dread of facing an enemy that struck so swiftly, then vanished into clouds. Kamikaze units, once the embodiment of Japanese resolve, hesitated when Corsairs patrolled overhead. Missions aborted. Attack runs veered off course. Fear had infiltrated Japan's last desperate weapon. The Corsair's psychological dominance spread beyond the skies. On the ground, Japanese soldiers described it as a demon screaming from above. Infantrymen huddled in tunnels and caves at the sound of its approach, knowing its strafing runs could cut down entire columns in seconds. Unlike the Zero, which symbolized elegance, the Corsair symbolized inevitability. This psychological war was just as decisive as physical battles. Japanese commanders noted the alarming decline in pilot morale, observing that fear of the Corsair was undermining discipline. One captured field note simply read, "When the blue gull wing appears, we do not fight, we endure." The Corsair had become more than a fighter. It was an icon of dominance, a predator that haunted dreams and shattered the will of its enemies. For Japan, the war was no longer about honor in the skies. It was about surviving a monster they couldn't stop. When the war ended in 1945, Japan's surviving pilots spoke of the Corsair not as a rival, but as a nightmare. What they remembered wasn't its specifications or design quirks, it was the feeling of helplessness. The Zero, once a legend, had been reduced to ashes by a fighter that broke every rule of traditional combat. Post-war interviews with Japanese engineers and commanders reveal a bitter truth. They had underestimated the Corsair from the start, mocking its bent wings, oversized nose, and clumsy reputation. Yet those very features had defined its superiority. They admitted with quiet respect that the Corsair was not elegant, but was brutally effective, an aircraft designed for dominance, not beauty. The Corsair's legacy was more than just air victories. It symbolized a turning point in warfare, the end of lightweight, honor-driven dogfighting, and the rise of heavily armed, fast, and survivable fighters. Japan's philosophy of Bushido in the sky was replaced by America's philosophy of overwhelming force. For Japanese veterans, the Corsair's name still carried weight. They described it less as a machine and more as a predator, something that stalked and struck without warning. One pilot confessed that hearing its whistle even decades later brought back memories of fear. Historians often call the Hellcat the Zero killer, but to Japan's airmen, it was the Corsair that broke their spirit. It was the plane they never wanted to face, because facing it meant defeat was already written. The Corsair wasn't remembered as beautiful. It was remembered as unstoppable. Its roar, its wings, and its shadow over the Pacific became the legacy of fear that outlasted the war itself. The story of the F4U Corsair isn't just about a machine. It's about a shift in the very nature of war. Japan entered the Pacific confident in the Zero's supremacy, but the Corsair crushed that confidence, not only with speed and firepower, but with a psychological presence that turned courage into fear. Its bent wings and haunting whistle weren't flaws. They were the symbols of a new age of aerial dominance. By the time surrender came, the Corsair had proven that adaptability, engineering, and overwhelming force could topple even the most legendary doctrines. For America, it was a monster-turned guardian. For Japan, it was a phantom they never wanted to face again. If you enjoyed this deep dive into aviation history, make sure to subscribe. What legendary aircraft class should we uncover next? Let us know in the comments below.